Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here with all of you today, and thanks for your consideration because we had a few votes in the Senate. I know that you've already heard from my colleague, Senator Tim Kaine, who I very much respect, and his dedication on the Armed Services Committee to making sure that our military remains strong, and I appreciate that. I want to thank Vice Admiral Daly for the kind introduction and for your leadership very much, and also the U.S. Naval Institute. This is a very, very important institute, and this annual defense forum, I'm honored to be in the company of so many distinguished guests and to be present with so many important speakers. I certainly want to acknowledge Admiral Ferguson, the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and I want to thank him for, I know you've already heard from him, his service to our country, Secretary Mabus, as well as Colonel Hoffman for this important conversation. And as the Vice Admiral already mentioned, I come from a part of the country that is proud of our nation's rich naval heritage. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, located a stone's throw from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, is one of the oldest shipyards in the nation, established in 1800. And as students of naval history know, in his famous report 2 centuries ago from the battle against the British on Lake Erie, Oliver Hazard Perry wrote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." Today, if Perry were to pen a similar report, he might write, "We have met the enemy and they are us." In recent years, the administration, as well as Congress, have failed to make the difficult decisions to put our nation's fiscal house in order and to put us on a sustainable fiscal path. Among other things, this failure has damaged our nation's military readiness. The lack of a budget, the unwillingness to reform entitlement programs, the reliance on short-term continuing resolutions. You know, I got elected in 2010, so I haven't been here long compared to many others. But since I've been in the Senate, I think by my count, there have been at least 16 continuing resolutions. And so I think that says it all in terms of short-term funding pieces that don't give the military or the rest of the government the certainty needed to plan. Failure to pass timely defense authorization and appropriations bills, as well as the indiscriminate nature of the Budget Control Act, have left the Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard with an unprecedented level of fiscal uncertainty that makes effective planning virtually impossible, I would imagine. As the audience knows well, in October of 2007, the Chief of Naval Operations, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard came together for the first time to create a unified maritime strategy, which was entitled A Cooperative Strategy for the 21st Century Sea Power. I understand that the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard are working on an update to that maritime strategy, but have decided to potentially postpone finalizing and releasing the new strategy because of the ongoing uncertainty in Washington. Not an encouraging sign, is it? At a time when challenges to U.S. naval supremacy and threats to our national security are growing, they're not diminishing. The Navy is forward deployed and active, and the failure of Congress and the administration to do the basic work of governing has really resulted, unfortunately, I think, in declining U.S. naval readiness. But as Admiral Daly mentioned, I also serve as the ranking Republican on the Readiness Subcommittee, and so it's not just the Navy. We are seeing this across the forces right now. The theme for this year's Defense Forum here is shaping the maritime strategy and navigating the budget gap reality. The problem we face is that the strategy is not driving current budget decisions in the federal government or the Department of Defense. So we can have all the strategies we want, but if it's not driving anything in terms of the funding reality, then what does the strategy mean? Under sequestration, even though defense spending accounts for approximately 18% of the federal budget, defense spending is absorbing 50% of the sequestration cuts. It's difficult to identify any strategic rationale that would justify this approach, particularly when the defense of the nation is our foremost constitutional responsibility. And without it, we can't guarantee any other freedom. We can't guarantee a strong economy. We frankly can't guarantee anything else for the American people without a strong defense of this nation. To make matters worse, sequestration cuts approximately 10% across the board of most DoD and Navy accounts, regardless of their importance to our national security. And because we've exempted military personnel for understandable reasons, most accounts actually get cut about 14%. I think we can all agree that this approach to budgeting isn't fit for a family budget, and much less the greatest country in the world. Because it doesn't distinguish, it doesn't prioritize, it doesn't say this is more important to us than this, it just cuts across the board. The failure to establish priorities in federal spending not only has left military planners in the dark, but has also resulted in a growing gap between the Navy that we have and the Navy that our national security interests require. In this budget environment, it's reasonable to ask, how do we know how much we should spend on our Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard? To answer that question, we have to identify our national security interests and the threats to those interests, and determine what kind of Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard we need to protect our interests from those threats. And that doesn't seem what the discussion has been going on, and certainly not the time I've served in the Armed Services Committee. A quick survey of America's key national security interests demonstrates the importance of America's naval power. America's naval power is one of the distinguishing, if not one of the most important distinguishing factors between us and other countries in the world. In my view, the United States has 5 key national security interests in ensuring the supremacy of our naval power. And these also, I would say, are very broad national security interests that apply beyond the Navy. Preventing a catastrophic attack on our homeland, and I do serve on the Homeland Security Committee, and serving on that committee, I will reiterate again, that it's not safer out there. Suddenly, we're not in a position where we can suddenly draw back and think that the threats aren't out there anymore to the United States of America, and therefore we don't have to focus on making sure that we're ready. Second, maintaining access to the global commons, including sea, air, space, and cyberspace, which facilitates U.S. trade and access to key resources. 3, preserving a favorable global balance of power. 4, restoring America's economic health and maintaining and extending the open international economic system that benefits Americans and people around the world. And I would say also helps avoid conflict. 5, promoting the expansion of constitutional democracies and the observance of human rights. Yes, we are the United States of America, and this is important to us. No matter how you look at it, continued U.S. naval supremacy is central to these key national security interests. The U.S. Navy is responsible for the sea leg of our nuclear triad that is an essential component of our nation's nuclear deterrent. I had the privilege of working with Senator John Kyle when he was in the Senate. And one of the things he asked me to do when he left was to ensure that I would continue to look, and he asked a couple of us to do this, to make sure that our nuclear deterrent remains strong. Because it was something that he paid close attention to. I know many of you pay close attention to, but it isn't a top-line issue on the minds of so many people. But without it, we know that our country is not as safe. The United States Navy also plays an essential role in protecting the United States and our allies against ballistic missile attacks. U.S. naval supremacy fosters a balance of power that deters aggression, prevents war, assures our allies, and creates an international environment conducive to the growth of free trade. And with approximately 90% of globally traded goods traversing our oceans, U.S. naval supremacy has helped shipping lanes and maritime choke points free of obstruction that could threaten the U.S. and global economies. As a result, we cannot forget that thanks to American naval power, the United States has been one of the greatest forces for global economic growth and the open international economic system. We have been probably its greatest beneficiary, but we have also elevated many other countries around the world. And I think that there's not that connection often made with your average American in terms of why it's important to have a strong Navy. Well, you should look right to our economy. That's why it's important to have a strong Navy. Yet in fiscal year 2013, due to sequestration cuts, the Navy had to reduce its budget by about $11 billion. Now, they were able to mitigate some of those cuts by going to unobligated balances. However, despite offsetting some of these reductions, they still had to cancel 5 ship deployments in 2013. But the unobligated balances aren't there to the extent they were in 13 for 14. And 14 is going to get a lot tougher. Because if you look at the line of sequestration and what we're looking at this year for the 10-year mark, 14 and 15 kind of goes like this, 14 and 15, and then it goes back up. And so 14 and 15 are going to be particularly challenging years with regard to sequestration if we do not replace them, look at a more balanced approach, because one of the problems with sequestration is 60% of the pie was left off the table. 40% of what we spend our federal spending on is where all the cuts came from. And because we didn't take a big picture approach, it is disproportionate in terms of our defense and some of the non-defense areas, but particularly thinking about defense as being the foremost constitutional responsibility within our government. If sequestration is not addressed, according to Admiral Greenert, the Navy may need to cancel the planned procurement of a Virginia-class submarine, near and dear to my heart, of course, because of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, a littoral combat ship, and an afloat-forward staging base ship. The Navy may also be forced to delay the delivery of the Ford aircraft carrier and delay the mid-life overhaul of the George Washington aircraft carrier. Admiral Greenert has also said that the Navy would have to cancel procurement of tactical aircraft, cancel aircraft and ship maintenance, limit facility repair and renovation, and continue a civilian hiring freeze. As I mentioned, I represent the workers of the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and Portsmouth is one of our nation's 4 public shipyards and home to some of our nation's most skilled DoD civilians who maintain the Los Angeles-class and Virginia-class submarines. These submarines, as you're aware, are essential to naval power, to our American naval power. This is an area where right now we aren't meeting combatant commanders' needs. In fact, we're only meeting about 50% of combatant commanders' requests for the attack submarine fleet and its support. And having been to the shipyard, I will tell you that the workers that work on maintaining the Los Angeles and Virginia-class submarine fleet, they're very talented individuals in terms of their skill sets, in an area where actually there are great needs in the private sector. So we can't kid ourselves when we think about technology and training that if we don't invest in our readiness, and I use them as an example of the best and the brightest wanting to work for the defense of the nation, there are other private sector companies that will take away, particularly in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields, where there is a global shortage right now. The Navy currently has about 285 ships and submarines. If sequestration continues, the fleet, what we have been told, would decline to about 255 ships in 2020, and that's more than 50 ships fewer than the Navy's validated requirement of 306, which is what they have said we need. And how is that consistent with a rebalance to the Asia-Pacific? How would such a reduction in our fleet be consistent with the continued challenges in the Middle East? How would that be consistent with our national security interests? There is either a ship present patrolling the maritime choke point, or there isn't. Presence matters, right? We can talk about a lot of different things, but if we're not there, then we can't have the influence. We can't be where we need to be prepared. There is either an Aegis-class ballistic missile defense combat ship protecting a particular region from ballistic missiles, or there isn't. There is either a Virginia-class submarine collecting intelligence offshore, or there just isn't. And what does that mean for our nation? In light of the difficult budget environment for the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard, it is more essential than ever that the services scrutinize. I will say this, as someone who thinks that there's a disproportionate cut being taken by our military right now, I will also say that with this, The Navy and every branch of our services has even greater responsibility now to rethink how they do things, to ensure that every dollar spent is maximized for the defense of this nation. It is more essential than ever that the services scrutinize every budget line to identify savings, eliminate waste, prioritize spending, and no more acquisition debacles. We just can't afford it. We cannot afford it, and we have to be smarter about it. There was an op-ed today by Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, in the Wall Street Journal. And he makes the point that the fleet size and the fighting forces in the Navy have shrunk dramatically since the early 1990s, but that the civilian and uniform bureaucracy has more than doubled. And so that needs to be reviewed as well. I know that Secretary of Defense Hagel has announced that he wants to do a 20% reduction in the bureaucracy, and good for him. We need to do that. We need to be focused on how can we do better with less, particularly those of us who are going to advocate when you need more. And we should have the responsibility to do it. Instead of doing it in an across-the-board, chop everything approach, we need to do it in smart ways. And I know that the good ideas are in this room. I know with the collective expertise in this room that you have excellent ideas about how we can do better with what we have, understanding that it won't solve all of sequestration, that we do have to address sequestration if we want to maintain naval supremacy. Let me just conclude with this. I think we're going to continue to have this problem. Right now, I serve on the Budget Committee, and the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Chairman Murray, is negotiating with the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Chairman Ryan, to come up with funding for the government for, we hope, the rest of this year. Let me just say, we need that at a minimum, because this 3-month kick the can down the road, no matter what the funding level is absurd. No one can plan, never mind strategize about what our plan should be in terms of our national security, if you're always worried about the next month and next month. But in this, I know that the discussions right now are centered on trying to address these 2 years of sequestration. And I certainly hope that, at a minimum, we get some decisions made for this country so that we don't find ourselves in another foolish shutdown situation or something that leads to more uncertainty for our military at a time when they need certainty. But let's step back for a minute. Even with a short-term agreement, we all know what needs to be done, don't we? We need a big fiscal deal for the nation. Something that sets the course for the fiscal planning of the nation well beyond 3 months, well beyond a year, but really looking forward to how do we reform our outdated tax code? How do we take on entitlement programs that amount to a big part of our budget? If you put all the mandatory spending in, it's about 60%. Medicare goes bankrupt in 2026, Social Security in 2033, the Social Security Disability Fund within 2016. If we do not take on those big problems with a large fiscal deal for the nation, which, by the way, is going to be tough for Republicans and tough for Democrats, or it won't get it done. If we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves having this conversation like Groundhog Day over and over again. And ultimately, we end up sacrificing the readiness of our Navy, but the readiness of all of our armed forces, and our nation becomes less safe because we've not taken on the difficult questions of really getting our fiscal house in order and making some tough calls on behalf of the American people. I ultimately see that as the most important thing we can do for the defense of this nation, so that we don't continue robbing the Department of Defense, depleting it down to where we put our country at risk because we haven't taken on the other issues. As hard as they may be politically, they are not as hard as what our men and women in uniform do every day on our behalf around the world. So I end with that. Moving forward, I will continue to do all that I can to push the federal government on this issue, to provide the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard with the fiscal certainty that they need to best protect our country and our interests. We can never assume that the shipping lanes will remain open in the absence of America, that peace between great powers will hold if America is weak, and that rising powers will not challenge our core interests. I think all of you, I know many of you are astute students of history and have studied history well, and you know better from looking at history. If the United States wants to maintain the security of the American people and our allies, as well as the open international economic system that is the lifeblood of our nation's prosperity, there is simply no substitute for United States naval supremacy. And with that, I'm honored to be here with all of you, and I open it up for your questions. So thank you for having me. And thank you for waiting for me. Appreciate it. Yes.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. I'm going to ask you the same question I've been asking everybody because I'm OCD about it. I mean, the budget conference during the committee, although I don't believe you're actually in the room of the conference, what's your level of hope versus despair? You talked about the downside if you don't get a deal. Talking about, even the deal we have the best shot, that even the best possible deal is going to be a very partial one.
Sure.
How optimistic are you that we'll get even the partial solution? What are the potential pitfalls? What's your level of confidence in your colleagues to actually get this done, and then to sell it to the whole chamber?
Well, let me just say, I don't think there's stomach for another shutdown, thankfully. And so I think that does give us, I think it gives me optimism that there will be an agreement. The question that I have yet is how long will the agreement be? Will it give us the level of certainty that we need to be able to plan? Even though I serve on the Budget Committee, a lot of this is happening, as I mentioned up front, between Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan, and so all of the details have not been brought forward at this point. But both of them are expressing a very strong sense of optimism. I think the pitfalls are that they come forward with an agreement, and on both sides of the aisle, people start torpedoing it for some reason or another, and then it falls apart, even if they come to an agreement. And so the question has to be, once they announce it, making sure that there's been obviously a proper vetting, that people understand what's in it, but then an understanding that comes together in a broader group of members, because that's where I see the pitfall, because that is how many deals can fall apart, as you know. But right now, I'm hearing optimism, which is good. Yes?
Yes, I'm Russell King. I have a question about geothermal areas. The 2004 tsunami was caused by an undersea geothermal area off of Sumatra, and I think the net result of it is that we dispersed our military assets more than at any time in our history, it seems, because we had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were going all over the Indian Ocean, which is thousands and thousands of miles away from there. But there are two Chinese military officers who wrote this book, Unrestricted Warfare, in which they talked about the possibility of actually using geothermal weapons to generate tsunamis. And so my question is, I think NOAA is responsible for monitoring these dangerous geothermal areas, but do you see a naval role, and where would NOAA's role end and the Navy's role begin?
Well, I have to tell you, I don't know probably as much as you do, or as much as I should, to be able to give you a thorough answer on this. I happen to serve on the Commerce Committee as well, which has oversight over NOAA. So I probably would be the intersection of all three committees relevant to this particular issue. But I don't know enough about it to be able to answer your question. But I would be happy to look at this in more detail and also have follow up with you. Appreciate it. So after, I would love to get your card, and then we can have a further discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Barry Moore, Liberty University. By the way, we'd like to have you come down and talk to us.
Okay, terrific.
I think we know the answer, but I want to hear your position on it. And I've heard you on Fox News many times talk about this. What impact does the runaway national debt have upon the readiness of the U.S. Armed Forces in the short and the long term? Your comments?
Well, I think where we see ourselves is that it really undermines the readiness of our forces in the sense that, well, let me just put it this way, we only have 2 combat-ready brigades right now in our Army. So in other words, we have so many of our, right now in the Air Force, we've got a huge amount of problems with lack of training hours of how many units are ready to go. And so we also have, we've come home from Iraq, we're dealing with the bilateral security agreement in Afghanistan, and we've got a reset that needs to be done of our equipment, and not only a reset, but obviously all of the retraining, the readiness that we need to do with our troops that comes home from Afghanistan. We've got all of that happening at once when we are facing sequestration, which is a disproportionate cut on our military. So we can do everything better, which we should, and more efficiently, but that's not going to get us fully where we need to be. And so ultimately, that's why I said what we need is a large fiscal agreement for the nation that really takes on the $17 trillion in debt and the drivers. And by the way, the military is not the major driver of our debt. And there's some people that are out there pushing that, and it's not true. What are the major drivers of our debt right now we've got healthcare spending that is going up, mandatory spending. Those programs are going, whether it's Social Security, particularly Medicare, Medicaid, those programs are going up, increasing at a higher rate. The healthcare cost issue we face is an issue that we're also facing within the government too. So although we've seen some reductions, the long-term trajectory for those costs are really the challenge that we face. So if we don't take on those other questions because it's too politically hard, then ultimately we will find ourselves continuing to squeeze the military to a point where we get back to think about what happened in Korea with Task Force Smith. I mean, that is unacceptable, and we cannot do that to our men and women in uniform, where we ask them to go into a conflict and we are not prepared, and we are not in a position where they've had the training, the equipment, the support that they need. And that's where I think the real risk is for us as a nation. And what is the one thing we've been notably bad at? Predicting the next conflict, right? If someone in this room thinks that they can predict with great certainty what the next conflict would be, I want to meet them because they are closer to the Almighty than I am. But we have not been good at predicting that, and that's the problem, why we need to always be ready. And when America is strong, we are less likely to engage in a conflict. And when we are weak, that is when our adversaries, of course, will test us. And so then we are more likely to be drawn into something we don't want to be involved in.
Senator, I have a question.
Sure.
Going back to the development of the strategy, what advice would you give the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard about how to be effective in this venture? You've had some discussion as the morning has worn on here about what is the right audience, the need to set priorities, and the need to structure the argument against national priorities and make the case. How would you advise the military who's looking at the strategy scenario, based on your experience as a senator, how can they be more effective in this venture?
Well, I have to say, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I got elected in 2010, and I think that in order to be more effective in terms of the strategy is that you can't just declare a strategy. I mean, you have this so-called rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific region, okay? Well, we've obviously had a very strong presence in the Asia-Pacific region, so we weren't leaving the Asia-Pacific region, but it left everyone with the impression that somehow we weren't still going to be engaged in the Persian Gulf. I think that what the Navy needs to do is actually, all of you experts in the area, yes, engage you on the strategy, but engage the policymakers directly in the strategy, meaning we're not going to draft the strategy, but engage us more in that process, particularly the Congress, the HASC, and the SASC, because I think that we don't have the expertise that many of the people that would draw up the actual strategy. But what ends up happening, my experience, now again, I've only been here since 2010, it's announced and it's sort of put out there, and yet we all look at it and say, well, the resources don't match the strategy. What does this mean about where we see as huge issues still in the Middle East? And I feel like if they engage the policymakers more along the building of the strategy, it would have more practical application than just a document that we've created and we put on a shelf, but has no meaning in terms of the resources allocated and how the resources match up to what we're trying to accomplish. Because on the Armed Services Committee, we do, a very lengthy markup. I don't remember ever talking about, okay, how does this fit in our strategy? So whether it's a particular weapon system, whether it's a particular resourcing issue, as we're talking about it as policymakers. But without the connection to the policymakers, the strategy becomes irrelevant, doesn't it? So that's my thought. Engage us more and make the strategy more relevant to the policymakers, where when we are doing a defense authorization, the markup we actually have some discussion of the strategy. I don't even, other than asking the leaders of our military some questions, some of us as members will do in our hearings, I mean, how much do we really even engage on hearings in terms of the strategy and how the resources match the strategy? So those are my thoughts on it, of how we could be more active, and it could mean something in terms of the policymakers.
Okay. Well, I think this is it, and
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And we'll follow. Thank you.
thank you. Let me say a couple words here. I just want to thank Senator Ayotte for making the time to come over here with her busy schedule and still keep her commitment in spite of all the votes going on this morning just down the block. And also thank you for your support in the Senate on all those committees and the important work of the U.S. Senate. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks for what you do. We appreciate it very much.
And I also want you to have your very own copy of Ships and Aircraft of the U.S. Fleet. Thank you very much.
This is excellent. This will be perfect for my coffee table, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.